All right, let's do Genesis chapter 4 now. So remember, in Genesis chapter 3, sin came into the world, and as time goes by, it seems to increase in intensity. Sin does. So, but now Adam and Eve have to go on with their lives and start, having kids and all that, and they've already decided for the rest of mankind whether they will live in sin or whether they will live without sin and death in the world. And they had the power to make that decision. Remember, they were the rulers. They had the power to make that decision. So before we go blaming God for everything that goes wrong in the world, we need to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's start with chapter 4. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. And my footnote says that Cain means gotten one. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of the flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So these are Adam and Eve's first children and the two eldest. And they have children, I'll just preface it, they have children all their lives. Which shows the quality of their bodies is much better than what we have today, because they just didn't age like we did. Remember the water canopy up in the air? They were protected from the sun and whatnot. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So Cain and Abel were the first children, and they have jobs. Remember, they have to really work to grow the food now. So Cain, that's his job, basically, is farming, and he has to grow stuff. And then Abel deals with the animals. He's a keeper of the flocks. So a rancher, a farmer and a rancher. Okay, verse 3. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But for Cain and his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became angry, and his countenance fell. In other words, his head was droopy, and he looked depressed. So this is interesting, and there's about 3 different reasons I found that people think that the Lord really didn't like Cain's offering. But he did accept Abel's offering. And we don't know what instructions they were given about bringing offerings to the Lord. This is the first record we know of anybody ever bringing an offering. They may have been doing it, but the Lord didn't tell us that. And Adam and Eve really had no reason to bring an offering before sin came into the world. Anyway, this offering that Cain brought of the produce just really wasn't accepted. Now, later in the Bible, some produce offerings are accepted, because there were all kinds of offerings later that God tells people to bring, including grain offerings and all of that. But at the beginning here, Abel's offering was like an animal. He had killed an animal and brought one of his firstlings, one of his firstborns, and their fat portions and whatnot. So one of the reasons people think that Cain's offering was not accepted is that there was no death involved. And, when Jesus comes later to pay for sin, a death is required to pay for sin. And a lot of people think this is symbolic of that. And that's always what I have believed it to mean. Some people also think that it is because Cain did not bring his first crops or his best crops. I guess that's a possibility, but we don't know the instructions. So although God tells people to bring their first and best later, he hasn't at this point, unless we're unaware of it. And there was another one. What was the other one? Oh, shoot. Can't remember what the other. Oh, blood, I guess. Yeah, that there was no blood shed. But I guess that has to do with death. So they go together. So anyway, my assumption was that a death was required because this would be symbolic of, oh, I know what it was. It was that Cain having to work so hard to grow those crops, that his offering represented his own works. And again, we are not saved by our own works. We're saved by the works of Jesus Christ, which was a death. And it's assumed that Abel's offering represented a death, and that Cain's offering represented his own works. So again, I just always thought of it as, a death was required, and that represented that Jesus would eventually pay for our sins. But let's get on with it. We could go on for that forever and ever. There's also, I should have written it down. And maybe I'll make note of it in the footnotes. But there's a passage somewhere in the New Testament, I believe, that says that Abel had faith, and I think Cain had a lack of faith. And I don't know why you would have a lack of faith when you could actually see God with your own eyes. But anyway, I might try to just put that in the notes because I forgot to write that down where it was. So anyway, let's go to... Okay, Cain's all bummed. He's pouting, and his face is fallen. He's looking all depressed. So let's go down to verse 6. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it." So doing well... I don't know exactly what is meant by that, except that he didn't bring what the Lord had told him to bring. And I thought it was interesting when it says sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must master it. So sin obviously has some kind of power over human beings, that it can lure them in. And it makes me think of, the Lord of the Rings, the ring, it has some kind of power, and it just draws people to it, and it has to be destroyed. It has to be mastered and thrown into the lake of fire or whatever. And obviously, God sees that Cain is being kind of overcome, and he knows it could be a problem. It could lead to other things. And so he's warning him here not to let that happen. And he has to overcome it, or to, what does the Lord say? You must master it, which I'm sure takes some practice. So he's trying to get Cain to not let sin take him over and have its way with him. Because remember, sin's in the world now. It's just roaming free, and death as well. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him. The first death of a person, and it's a murder. How lovely is that? And the first kids that Adam and Eve ever have, how devastating. Their first two kids are already... Adam and Eve paid a great price when they brought sin into the world. Their eldest son killed their younger son. How devastating would that have been? And they'd never experienced death except that animal that the Lord had killed, and then the animals that they killed for sacrifice. So then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" First of all, he's lying. And God isn't asking because he doesn't know. He wants Cain to confess here. And Cain is lying. He clearly knows what happened to his brother. He's the one who did it. He said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Now, that shows kind of the power of blood. I heard about some tests the military did on blood, and I don't know if this was a long time ago, so I might be telling it funny, but they would take a person's blood and put it in a petri dish or something, and they would put it in another room, and then they would show that person scary movies and stuff like that, and the person's blood in the other room actually had a reaction to that. So I thought that was really bizarre. But anyway, blood obviously has some kind of power and life in it. So this blood, God can hear it crying out from the ground. So there's going to be consequences for Cain here. Verse 11, now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. So even though they're already having to work hard to grow their crops, there's even another curse here. It says cursed from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground. So there's a curse upon Cain from the ground, and it's not going to yield its strength anymore. And I'm not sure what all that might mean, but there's going to be more problems probably with growing things, and that's his job. So, okay, Cain is pretty devastated by this, as we'll see in verse 13. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground. From your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So the Lord said to him, therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord appointed a sign for Cain, so that no one finding him would slay him. Then Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So Cain is the first person who's not going to be living where God is dwelling anymore. So he's not going to see God anymore. And yet he says, obviously more and more people are going to be born and are being born. And because he's worried about people killing him. And God said that he's going to put some kind of sign on him that will let people know when they see him that they cannot slay him. And I wonder what that sign might have been. It had to be something obvious. So anyway, I'm real curious about that one. But he went away from where the Lord would come down and meet with man. He went away and lived in this place called Nod. And he's no longer seeing God anymore. I don't know if he saw his parents anymore. It doesn't go into that. But he obviously has a wife. So Adam and Eve have had more children than just these two. They're obviously adults because he has a wife. And so Adam and Eve probably had several children. The only people at that point that they would have been able to marry until the siblings started having kids would be their siblings. Now, some people freak out at that because it's certainly not something that God would permit today. And the time comes in the books of the law, the first 5 books somewhere, where God tells people not to marry their siblings anymore. But Adam and Eve were made of such a quality. They had no flaws. There were no genetic problems in the beginning. So anyway, we could go on and on about that. There's more things you can read about that. I always look at stuff from Answers in Genesis, but there are other organizations all about Genesis that teach about Genesis, and you can look up some details in that. That's kind of a way you could expand your study. So anyway, Cain has gone out. He's devastated. He's going to be away from God, and he is worried about being away from God. He says that. So verse 17, Cain had relations with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And he built a city and called the name of the city Enoch after the name of his son. Many years are going by in this chapter. Many years. And so I wish we could get more detail because it would be fascinating. But, the kids are growing up. They're having kids. Adam and Eve have kids all their lives. So they've had many kids than just Cain and Abel. We're just not hearing the details of all of them or how many there were. Now to Enoch was born Methuselah, and Methuselah became the father of Methuselah. I had to look up the pronunciations of those. And Methuselah became the father of Lamech. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other is Zillah. Now, God never told anybody to take 2 wives. This is the first person who does, Lamech. And it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail about his relationship with his 2 wives. And just because God records what happens in the Bible, he tells what the people did, that doesn't mean he approves of it. A lot of people think just because this event was recorded that God thought it was just great that Lamech took 2 wives. Well, God never, he made 1 wife for Adam. He didn't make 2 wives for Adam. And in the future, when people take multiple wives, it is truly chaotic, and the chaos is recorded, but people act like, well, God approves of it. Well, he put up with it, but it did cause a lot of chaos. Every time somebody took more than 1 wife, it caused chaos. So anyway, but this one doesn't go into a lot of detail. Ada gave birth to Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipe. As for Zillah, she also gave birth to Tubal-Cain, the forger of all implements of bronze and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, "Listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold. Kitty, move it. Move. She always tries to help me out. Adam had, okay, so, stop it, Kitty. So all these generations are passing by, but Adam and Eve are still alive. So their children are having children, and their grandchildren are having children, and Adam and Eve are still alive, and they are going to have more kids. They have kids all their days. So in verse 25, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son, and God named him. God didn't name him. Let me back up. Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth, to him also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Now that's a really interesting statement. So Adam and Eve have another child, and they probably had many more. I don't know why Seth is pointed out as the replacement for Abel. Maybe he's the next son that was born after Abel. I don't know. But anyway, they obviously have had more kids, and it talks about that later. And it mentions right away they give birth to Seth, and then Seth has a son named Enosh. So, I mean, they just, many years go by, and they, between 2 verses there. But the last statement really intrigues me. It says, then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Now, why would men begin to call on the name of the Lord then? And my thought is that they were calling out to him because they could no longer see him. That's what I believe it means. So the time came when they just couldn't see him anymore. After Adam and Eve sinned, they could see him for quite a while. But even Cain, when he killed Abel, God didn't. He sent Cain out, but he talked to him. He even did something, gave him some kind of sign that he would be protected, so nobody could harm him. So, when Seth must be quite a bit younger, because when he begins to have kids, people begin to call on the name of the Lord, meaning they probably could no longer see him. So this is just one of the results of sin. As sin gets worse and worse, people can't really be around a holy God. They couldn't handle it. Later, if people had been exposed to God, it would have really killed them because he was so holy and they were so sinful. So anyway, let's get on to our 3 points for this chapter. It took a little bit longer than I thought it would. Okay, number 1. After sin came in the world, people rapidly multiplied. Eventually, people could no longer see the Lord. About the time Seth was having kids, people could no longer see the Lord. And who knows when he was having kids, because, he could have had kids when he was in his 20s. He could have had kids when he was in his hundreds. So, because that's the kind of the way things were in the Old Testament. So let's go on to number 2. Cain killed his brother Abel, who was the first human death and first murder victim. Let's read that one more time. Cain killed his brother Abel, who was the first human death and first murder victim. Sorry about Kitty. Okay, and number 3, Cain was the first person to live away from God. Again, by the time Seth started having kids, nobody could see him. And Adam and Eve are not dead yet. So I'm assuming they couldn't see him anymore either. It must have been hardest on them because they caused it all. And also, they were used to seeing him from the very beginning. That must have been really awful. So I'm sure it would be scary not to have him there. Even though his Holy Spirit, I'm assuming, they could still call out to him. Obviously, they were, but they couldn't see him anymore. So let me read that one more time for the third point. Cain was the first person to live away from God. But even then, God wanted to protect him. So this was a pretty interesting chapter, but it gets better from here on. So stick with me.